Welcome back to Leaders, a podcast dedicated to exploring the best leaders this world has ever seen. Prior to diving into today's episode, I wanted to take the time to invite you to follow some channels I've created in relation to the podcast. I've created a LinkedIn page where I'll be posting episode information as well as some short essays and notes from related content. Most recently, episode 2 covered Steve Jobs, and literally on the day that I released the Steve Jobs episode, the Steve Jobs Archives, official Steve Jobs information, released a short novel detailing a lot of Steve's own emails, notes, even a foreword from his former wife that really dove into and double-clicked on a lot of the leadership style and management information that I covered in the episode. And so I intend on posting a small tidbit of information on 5 or 6 things that I found most valuable from skimming that, as well as listening to some other podcasts that have covered off on that book. So that is one of many examples of kind of evergreen content that I intend to push out in addition to the episodes, as there is always content, information, new information, namely too, for each of these leaders. And so we can continue to build up a great knowledge base through not only the episodes, but some other content that is out there. I have created a Twitter page for it as well, so you can follow that. And then I would encourage anyone who has listened to the podcast and enjoys it to review the podcast on iTunes and Spotify, as I know that helps to spread the reach and audience of that as well. So share the word. This has just been, mostly amongst family and friends, as most things that start out really do. And I appreciate anyone who's reached out and said they have listened to the podcast and enjoyed it. So I encourage you to share that if you find it something of value in the podcast. And the podcast world, not to get too deep into this, but a lot of people start podcasts. I feel like a lot of podcasts started in the COVID area, and people just had a lot of time on their hands, so that, hey, let's start a podcast. It's very easy to set up, but something like 75%, and that number actually could be low, don't make it past a few episodes. So really, I intend, and my mission is to make this a year-long, maybe multi-year-long journey to cover the best leaders in the world. So I'm not going anywhere, and I really think that as I refine my process, research, and there's just a wealth of leaders and content out there for me to cover. So there's no shortage of content for me to push out within episodes. So I intend on doing this for a long time, and it's something that I can learn from and everyone else can learn from. So I feel like I've started and stopped other projects in the past, but I think it was largely because I had initial interest in what I was trying to do, but not sustained interest. And again, this idea of leadership, as well as studying the best business executives and leaders that the world has ever seen, is something that has been on my mind for many years. So it's always kind of on the top of my mind. So I intend again on pushing these episodes out in the future. And I do feel that this knowledge should be shared wider, and I think podcasting audio is an ever-growing medium to do that. And you can cover off on a lot in 30, 40 minutes of episodes. So just a little bit of an overview there. So with that, let's get into episode 3. And episode 3 covers Jack Welch. He was the famed GE executive and CEO for close to 20 years. You probably know Jack from any time from a management and leadership standpoint. I think he might be the most revered and most mentioned business executive out there. Prior to really studying him and seeing what content and material was out there for him, I really felt that he was always painted in this positive vein. But I think as I dive into this more, it's I think, more of a mixed legacy that he leaves within the business world, as far as the management principles and business that he set up, along with the legacy that he left, particularly within GE itself, and some of those practices and how they've lived on, that really creates this kind of contrasting view in some people's eyes of the legacy that he leaves as a business executive. So I see, as we again compare his legacy, his management practices to previous episodes. So Jim Senegal, I think there are some parallels in some ways to what he has adopted and maybe some of the background there. And then there's also some parallels too to Steve Jobs that I see within Jack and his business and management practices. So I definitely want to highlight those as we go through here. And so with that, we'll just do a quick overview of Jack and his career. So he started as an engineer within GE at the company in 1960. And similar to Senegal, I believe, he grew up in the industry. He had extensive business experience within this industry that vaulted him up to a chairman and CEO position of General Electric. And so he served from 1981 until the fall of 2001, which again is a 20-year span during which the company grew into the most valuable enterprise on earth. So a lot of people now, they see GE almost 20 years later after he departed, and things have been sold off. GE's reputation, as well as its value in the marketplace, has come down. So it is crazy to think that GE at some point was what we would view today as Apple and Amazon in those 80s, 90s, and early 2000 area. So it had a market value of $12 billion, the 10th largest of all American public companies. It was America's market cap leader from 1993 until the summer of 1998, reaching a high of $598 billion and averaging $400 billion or so during Welch's last years as CEO. Under Welch's leadership, GE became America's greatest business powerhouse. In 1981, GE had annual sales of $25 billion. So this is when Jack, again, initially is chairman and CEO, and at the start, $25 billion with earnings of $1.5 billion. Fast forward to the year 2000, the last full year before he retired, and their revenues had reached $130 billion with earnings of $12.7 billion. And in 2001, the company's revenues reached $126 billion, while earnings rose to $14 billion. So take as you will of some of the business and management practices that he's instilled, and whether you agree or disagree with those, I think the business results from an earnings revenue perspective speak to high success from his CEO and the business decisions that he's made. And so with all that success, though, I do want to also highlight, this is a common theme amongst the episodes before I dive in. I think most of the content here, again, will be those mantras, philosophies, quotes, and leadership styles that I've bucketed into a few different key categories. But before we go into that, I think as much career moments and business success that he had within those 20 years, I think we also have some learning lessons from the failures that he had within his GE years, whether that be the mistakes and failures that he self-identified or that others from outside identified. And I think while we can't really pinpoint a particular event failure within the GE years that most people recognize, I think the biggest failure that people point to when they think of him and this kind of complicated legacy that he leaves is that he picked the successor to the CEO seat that when he retired in 2001, he had lined up a few considerations and business executives for that position. Ultimately, he picked Jeff Immelt, and what Jeff quickly discovered was that Welch had handed him a mess, a company built out of pieces that had no logical connection. And once 2008 rolls around, the global financial crisis arrives. The elaborate game that Welch had been playing with GE Capital, which is a subdivision of GE that he had built out, collapsed. And arguably, there could have been a bigger mistake here. Unlike it had done with finance, GE failed to see high tech as a right field with enormous long-term potential. So it didn't go for it aggressively and nimbly. Its high tech forays were too late and bureaucratic. And so it does mention that from a business transformation standpoint in GE. He inherited a lot of different subdivisions and business units that eventually, and this will go more into the leadership style and business strategies that he adopts, but he kind of tries to trim that down and trim the excess into a few core businesses that he wants to be either number one or number two in the industry for. And so this tech boom that we see between the 80s and 90s and 2000s, at least you can make the argument that GE didn't really capitalize on that as a business unit per se to really set them up to succeed in the future. And as we've seen through the 2000s here, they've frankly a little bit struggled with the adaptation to this high-tech environment that we see today. So there is that. So Jeff Immelt, I think, struggled very much as the CEO of GE and made some, I guess, questionable decisions in his spot as to how we view GE today. And in addition to that, Jack, when he was CEO, had a failed attempt to acquire the industrial giant Honeywell in the 11th hour of his term. And the public uproar around the terms of his extravagant retirement package from GE. So there's a lot of different details around when he retired and what his demands were from GE in regards to that. And I think the retirement package that he yields is something around, $400+ million, which, take of it what you would want. On one end, you could argue he really had success with the business value and driving success for GE, so maybe he felt that was warranted, but in some cases you can see that, and that's kind of ridiculous to a lot of the demands that he had for the retirement package for GE. And Welch's personal behavior comes under scrutiny too. He had hard partying characterized his early days, and then treatment of women, and some scandals around marriages and things like that. You can also point to a little bit from how he was viewed within the company and maybe by some other employees. And so, again, that points back to kind of a complicated business legacy of maybe how some people viewed him as a person. Finally, I guess to kind of round out this failure section within him, for Jack himself, he always points to as a mistake and or a failure. At some point, a factory had blown up under his leadership, and so he always kind of jokes and points to that as being a big mistake in regards to how that plant may have been managed or a lack of oversight there. And in an interview as well, he also mentions acquiring an investment bank. And so as they funnel up a lot of this growth, typically in a high growth cycle, you're going through also a lot of M&A opportunities. So he talks about they were growing so fast and acquiring all these companies that at some point they hadn't done the due diligence to acquire this investment bank. They go ahead and do it and they acquire it, but ultimately he knows fairly right away that this investment bank, he always mentions that They're not talking about the values, the culture, or anything else within the business. They're always focused just on their bonuses. And ultimately, he feels that this investment bank that they've acquired is a bad culture fit. And he then is active on this and ends up selling the investment bank to UBS. So oftentimes, as we've seen with other companies, mergers and acquisitions is always a very hard business, I guess, activity to succeed in. A lot of the times, some acquisitions fail, some acquisitions do really well, but just interesting to point out that that is a common theme usually of what people view as failures when they look back on their careers. And so that'll round out the failures section here. I really want to dive into the meat of this podcast, which will be those mantras and leadership style, because I think Jack, in his company, developed out a comprehensive business strategy, management and leadership tactics, and I think a big component of that, which will have its own section, will be removing excess. So he really believed in that, and we'll dive into a little bit more of what that meant. And then finally, to round it out, so how do you adopt a lot of these overarching business principles? Well, his thought was to create particular programs that really honed in on some of these principles. So we will go into a few different programs that he ended up developing within GE itself that led to some of this success. So just to kind of highlight, I guess, to start, would be these key business strategies that he instilled that then funneled into how he thought through leadership and management. So the first aspect was his pioneering of some of the most critical business strategies of the late 20th century, among which were restructuring, downsizing, and a focus on being number one or number two in the marketplace. The second was his deep-seated conviction that business is, underneath it all, very simple, and executives should not overcomplicate the whole subject. So there are components of operationally how you should run a business, but then also within the leadership and management position, how should people be set up to succeed within his company. So as we get into now the next section, which is management and leadership tactics, there's a lot to unpack within here. So over time, he'd helped countless business leaders to manage less, diminish bureaucracies, and reduce management layers. It has also been a catalyst for granting greater authority to employees and showing greater respect for their ideas. So starting each day as if it were your first day on the job, he told his managers, make whatever changes are necessary to improve things. Re-examine your agenda constantly. Rewrite it if necessary. So before foraying, I guess, into the next section, I want to take a little bit of a step back and say that a lot of the content that I consumed in regards to Jack here is from his book on leadership, abridged from Jack Welch and the GE Way. And there's a few other books that Jack, either his memoir, Winning, which I take excerpts from as well, and there's a few others that have been written over time on Jack. So those are great resources, I would say, from the content that comes from this podcast. And, you know, I also looked at a few other different articles, and they kind of, again, unpack a lot of this complicated legacy with catchy headlines as to, was Jack the best business executive of our era, or was he arguably the worst? And authors can make the arguments one way or another based on some of the things that I've already said here. But anyway, back to the Jack Welch GE Way, prescription for change. And his thoughts on change are to accept change. And he says, to be a successful business leader, do not treat change like the enemy. Instead, develop a positive attitude toward change. Learn how to read the ever-changing business environment. Never stop thinking about how to change. Encourage your employees to believe that changes, when they happen, can become positive opportunities. And so essentially, Welch asks one key question when it comes to management. Is it better to be hands-on or hands-off? His answer: the less managed, the better off the company. He dislikes the very notion of quote-unquote management. Most managers, in his view, overmanage, and in doing so help to create the bureaucratic sloth and sluggishness that kills large companies. And I think that's just an interesting way to look at the current landscape as we delve into a lot of the tech companies that you see today and the excess or the overhiring that they've done at the management level or the middle management level. And you've seen companies like Facebook, Amazon, a lot of the bigger tech companies really emphasize and really focus in on getting leaner and getting more efficient with all these different layers of management that they've created over time, and frankly overhired a lot of the positions within their companies. So I just see parallels within his philosophy there and what we're seeing within the marketplace there. So I just wanted to kind of note that quickly and dive back more into how Welch explained that there were kind of 4 types of manager. And so we'll see one who has the values and makes the numbers. Love them, hug them, take them onward and upward. Second one, doesn't have the values, doesn't make the numbers. Get them out of there. That's easy too. The third one has the values, doesn't make the numbers. Give them a second and third chance. The fourth one's the one you're talking about, the tough one. The horse's neck that makes the numbers on the backs of people. The go-to person in an organization. And an organization that doesn't root them out, can't talk about values, can't talk about the human equation. So just thinking through the different quadrants there, I think it's interesting at how he sort of sections off these type of managers. And there's those 4 types, and then how to really treat each of them, whether it becomes making the numbers as well as these value components as the 2 key variables to how to really assess the type of managers that you have and what to do with them. So take that second one, for example. They don't have the values. They don't make the numbers. Easy. You fire those people. And he was ruthless, and it's said over time that he has the notion of cutting the bottom 10% year over year. So over time, over these 20 years, is it argued that Jack was more or less directly responsible for firing maybe the most people ever from that regard. So he was kind of ruthless in some of those management and leadership tactics. If you don't have it, then we're going to let go of you, simply. So more on the management versus leadership definitions, as well as what constitutes each, I think is, again, important to highlight, and something that we'll run into, I think, very frequently as we talk through leadership styles within each of these executives and how they view leaders versus managers. So I also wanted to highlight that distinction that he makes there from the quote-unquote notion of management, and what do actual leaders do instead. So leaders inspire with clear vision of how things can be done better. Leaders talk to their employees, talk with their employees, filling them with vision, getting them to perform at levels that employees themselves don't think possible. And Jack actually, from a company standpoint too, has a philosophy on 5 different questions that he asks in terms of really evaluating them. So the first one is, what does your global competitive environment look like? Second, in the last 3 years, what have your competitors done? Third, in that same period, what have you done? Fourth, how might competitors attack you in the future? And then fifth and final, what are your plans to leapfrog over them? So you can ask these questions, I think, from a company perspective, but then also to your leaders, managers, as to how they're thinking about their business. And I think within the vein of GE too, it's also on those business units as to how do you think about GE Finance or GE Power, things like that. So he continually used these questions to evaluate the business that way. And Jack talks about what his job as CEO was to find great ideas, exaggerate them, and then spread them like hell around the business with the speed of light, and to put resources in to support them. Keep finding ideas. That's the job of just about all of our CEOs. And within a CEO and within a leader, he again highlights some of those characteristics of what makes for a great leader. And he says, first off, they should be bursting with energy. Second, they should be able to actually develop and implement a vision, not just talk incessantly about it. And they must know how to spread enthusiasm like wildfire by firing up the entire company. And this next section really reminds me of Steve Jobs and how he viewed with the type of people that he wants to surround himself with. And so Jack's quote within here, and this concept of A, B, and C players really resonates with how Steve viewed it as well. So he says, too many of you work too hard to make C's into B's. It is a wheel-spinning exercise. Push C's onto B companies or C companies, and they'll do just fine. We're an A-plus company. We want only A players. We can get anyone we want. Take care of your best. Reward them, promote them, pay them well, give them a lot of stock options. And so Jack is almost fanatic when it comes to relentless consistency as part of those leaders and leadership tactics. So he believes in applying the business tenet to everything, checking a factory's plans, determining whether the training programs are effective, making sure that company values are alive and well at every level of the organization. Put another way, follow up on everything. It is a key measure of success for a business. And so as we kind of encapsulate what is a GE leader in the eyes of Jack, it's these qualities. It's always with unyielding integrity, have a passion for excellence, and hate bureaucracy. GE leaders are open to ideas from anywhere and committed to workout. So workout is a program that we will dive into in a future section. Live quality and drive cost and speed for competitive advantage. Have the self-confidence to involve everyone and behave in a boundaryless fashion. Create a clear, simple, reality-based vision and communicate it to all constituencies. Have enormous energy and the ability to energize others. Stretch, set aggressive goals. And finally, GE leaders reward progress, yet understand accountability and commitment. And so he feels that the only way to change people's minds is with consistency. If you have a simple, consistent message and you keep on repeating it, eventually that's what happens. And from these people and from these leaders, he always says to search for the best possible talent to run the business, and then let those new business leaders manage without your personal intrusion and interference. So again, this theme of being removed from that micromanagement or telling people what to do, or really it's more delegating, trusting those people that you hire because they are the top talent that will make the decisions that will lead to success for the company. And he says the only way to lead was to focus on company values. Numbers aren't the vision, numbers are the product. We always say that if you had 3 measurements to live by, they'd be employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, and cash flow. And so he has this business philosophy of focusing on people, not numbers. He urged GE employees to face reality, to lead, not manage, to change before it was necessary, to be boundaryless, to pursue simplicity. And so in that pursuit of simplicity and on this theme of removing excess, I wanted to dive into a little bit more of what that meant and a key philosophy of his that really funneled down to the company for how he implemented that. So he feels that corporate excellence came from getting rid of underperforming units and underperforming employees. And an important building block of his new strategy with this was to weed out certain businesses and really keep only those that dominate their markets. From now on, a GE business would have to be first or second in its market. So a few years into his leadership position and CEO, he has this sort of realization that GE is in way too many different business lines for which it's maybe 5th, 6th, 7th, whatever, something that is not just at the top of the line in terms of their industry. So he made then efforts and decisions to say anywhere from a business unit standpoint that we are either not currently first or second in or can't get a logical path to get there, we need to rid those businesses. So we're going to dive into a little bit more of what that meant. So one circle contained GE's core businesses. The second circle contained GE's high technology businesses. And the third circle contained its services businesses. Those businesses inside the circle, Welch wanted to nourish. Those outside, he wanted to jettison unless they could be fixed. So there's this motto that he adopts as a result of that, and it's fix, close, or sell. So soon after taking over, he began to tear bureaucracy apart. And a lot of the bureaucracy within the layers of management that he saw felt that it was promoting excessive sluggishness. So maybe some of those business units that are underperforming, it was partially a result of decisions requiring approvals or moving too slow within an industry that led to its downfall. So he felt that delayering was one of the key components to getting GE right and leading them to longer-term success. And delayering, he said, was one of the hardest parts of being a leader. But it is vital to eliminate managers who slow down a company and make it less entrepreneurial. Delayering makes it easier for the CEO to find out what's going on in the company, as there are fewer filters and fewer memos and meetings. He felt that small, sleek companies have huge competitive advantages. They communicate better. They move faster. They make it easier to identify the most talented leaders. And to that point, as we think about layers of management, bureaucracy, he also felt that there were way too many boundaries within GE. So we mentioned this before, but he talks about being boundaryless. So everywhere he turned, he found boundaries. And those boundaries existed between management layers, between engineers and marketing people, between GE and its customers, between full-time and part-time GE employees, as well as between GE and the whole outside community. So he wants to rid of those boundaries, and he feels that boundarylessness, an awkward term that Welch coined, defined the GE to which Welch aspired, an open, informal company where employees can move swiftly and effortlessly and connect to the outside world just as quickly and effectively. The fewer the boundaries, the higher the productivity, he argued. So he summed up his prescription for winning in 3 words that this highlights: speed, simplicity, and self-confidence. He says, "We want ideas from everyone, but somebody's got to run the ship. Now, that doesn't mean somebody runs the ship by directing it. Somebody runs the ship with a total input from everyone." And so, removing excess, a motto of fix, close, or sell. What other things can he do within an organization to really drive home this point? And so one of those things that he did was he launched what he calls a workout program. And so this empowered GE employees to suggest changes in the company's operations, big and small. We want to be more than that. We want to change the competitive landscape by being not just better than our competitors, but by taking quality to a whole new level. We want to make our quality so special, so valuable to our customers, so important to their success, that our products became their only real value choice. So a lot of the origin of the workout program was Welch understanding the business units and the business as a whole, and him really assessing that the level of quality that was being put out by GE at that point wasn't up to standard. So this idea of these intentional programs that are honed in on the highest quality really drove home that point. So he says the goal of the workout program was to make workers more productive and processes simpler and more clear-cut. Workout was designed to reduce and ultimately eliminate all of the wasted hours and energy that organizations like GE typically expend in performing day-to-day operations. At some workout sessions, the facilitator broke work issues into 2 categories: rattlers and pythons. Rattlers were the simple problems, those that could be shot, like a dangerous rattlesnake, and solved on the spot. Pythons were issues too complicated to unravel right away, just as no one could easily unravel a coiled python. And so GE, I think, sees great results from empowering some of the internal employees to think about this excellence towards quality and really having a voice within the company to suggest changes in operations that are going to make them more efficient and more effective. And part of this ongoing adoption towards quality was also brought through from another program. And the question was how to come up with a company-wide quality campaign that didn't repeat the mistakes of the prior programs. And so Welch and his colleagues found the answer in Six Sigma, the concept that had been pioneered by Motorola. And so part of this was this adoption towards high-quality standards and really bringing down the amount of defects. So the very manufacturing-driven sort of concept here from a Six Sigma standpoint from that team. And as part of the Six Sigma program that GE adopted, it also formed out product teams, each aimed at achieving the Six Sigma level of precision through a 4-step process known as MAIC. And the MAIC stood for measurement, analysis, improvement, and control. In addition to that, he took other one step in 1987 where he was issuing company-wide guidelines, and this was an 80-page booklet called Integrity, the Spirit and the Letter of Our Commitment. And every new employee was required to read the booklet and sign a card found in the booklet that they had read it. And it was clear for Jack that the ability to energize and the ability to empower some of those employees was the ingredient that counted. It was clear that he regarded honest, open, even confrontational debate as an essential ingredient of every good organization. He also believed that employees closest to the businesses and closest to the customers can teach the leaders. So through the adoption of these programs and through the adoption of, I would say, very concentrated and focused principles of eliminating access, as well as how to build, teach, and develop leaders, were some of the key principles that he helped to adopt within how he is viewed, as well as how GE was viewed in this vein. And so just to round things off for this episode will be a smaller section on mentors and heroes. And what I found interesting here is that I was doing extensive different searches of, who did Jack look up to, or, were there clips of him mentioning, oh, I really looked after this person, or I really admired this CEO or this leader, and honestly couldn't find too much on that front. And I think the quote that he's remembered by maybe speaks to that. So he says, from a mentorship standpoint, that there are no one right mentor. There are many right mentors, and everyone can be a mentor. And one of the things that I found interesting too is that he is credited with kind of founding this practice in 1999 to teach executives about the internet, and it was more so around the idea of reverse mentoring. And so it's grown, this concept of reverse mentoring has grown to encompass a broader agenda of intended goals. Reverse mentoring in action is where a less experienced employee has a unique opportunity to mentor a senior level associate. So it could be focused in on maybe those concepts that a less experienced employee may have more exposure to, and things like that. So, in the last few years, maybe it's more something around technology that I think there's this idea of mentoring in the reverse, so that traditional mentorship is always viewed as someone who is considered a mentor because they have been there, they have the extensive experience, and then they can guide a less experienced person and give them advice and mentorship that way. But I think it was interesting that Jack came up with the reverse of that. And I think, honestly, that's a very underutilized idea. And even around feedback, I think there can be upward feedback more so from a management and leadership development standpoint too. And so those principles, I would say, are very undervalued and underused in at least my observations within companies. And so, yeah, I think that concludes episode 3 here, diving into Jack Welch of GE fame. And overall, I think Jack leaves, again, that complicated legacy of, yes, he had great success as 20 years of CEO of GE, and they had really great business results of that. But I think that gets a little bit muddied when you talk through, well, what happened when he, after that, and he chose this successor that ultimately didn't lead to great business success. But there are things that Jack has implemented from a management and leadership standpoint. He adopted his own management and leadership institute, which is now an MBA program that is, I think, pretty high regarded in terms of instilling some of these management and leadership principles into people now. So I think he should get credit for a lot of these different business principles, whether you agree with all of them or not. There is some truth, and there is some, I guess, lasting legacy as to, what I was kind of pointing at before of, trimming the access, or really trying to be efficient within a business operational standpoint, that I think he instilled and that will continue to leave a legacy on. So hope you enjoyed this episode focusing on Jack Welch, and we'll see you for the next episode of Leaders.